So I want to start with some thank yous as well to the organizers of the Penn Climate Seminar for inviting me, to all of you for coming today, to Patrick, who did a phenomenal job putting all this together, and to Sonia for that really lovely introduction. It's a real treat to get to be able to share this project with you all. It is at the draft paper stage. So if you haven't had enough at the end of 40 minutes, feel free to shoot me an email. I would be happy to share a draft with anybody that wants to see this in paper form. So I'm going to talk today about new experiments in public power, building public renewables as climate change policy. And this work grew out of a series of observations I had about some things going on in the real world. So first in New York, after years of campaigning, activists were successful in getting legislation through that was called the Build Public Renewables Act. And it created essentially new legal authority for the state to build and own public renewables there. And then a year later, in the United Kingdom, the Labour Party campaigned to victory largely on a campaign to create a public renewables company called Great British Energy. And as I got ready to launch on a fellowship last spring at the University of Edinburgh doing some comparative work, one of the questions I decided to focus on is why both of these places decided that building public renewables was the right policy strategy for the moment. So that's what this presentation and the underlying research are seeking to think through is the politics and the shape and the possibilities for building public renewables as an answer to climate policy or as a piece of climate policy. So I thought maybe one way to frame my talk today would be to offer you a quote. This comes from an article written by energy geographer Brett Christophers. And this is from an article earlier this year that I think really speaks to the aims of this project. So I'm just going to read his quote quickly. Strikingly, the justifications for public ownership articulated by its advocates tend to be predominantly negative ones. The antagonist is drawn in bold, sharp lines, namely capitalist firms who are more interested in wringing profits out of customers than in offering decent services at decent rates while making infrastructure shipshape for a climate-stressed future. But the positive case, this is usually considerably hazier. Certainly it's obvious in outline, public ownership, but there's frequently much less detail about how it might be achieved, what it would look like in practice, and most importantly of all, why we should favor it. If extractivism is what we specifically denounce in private ownership, what specifically do we value in its public counterpart? Why, in short, champion it? So this project, I see it as an effort to try to fill this theoretical void and to understand the case for public power in its new legal forms in these experiments in both the United Kingdom and New York, which I'm going to argue look pretty different from past experiments in public power and need their own theory and sort of like a case for why they're an important part of the system. All right, so here's what I plan to talk about over the next little bit. I'm going to say a word by way of framing about the predominant way that the state has intervened to push climate progress in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Some new pressures that these places are facing. And then I'll spend most of the time talking about public renewables as a response to these pressures. So the legal forms that they're taking. I'm going to articulate a theory of what work I think they can do in this space and tell you a little bit about what they've been up to so far. And then I'll close by thinking through some of both the possibilities and the tensions that I think this new form of climate policy raises. Okay, so first, I want to start us in this concept of the mid-transition. This is a concept developed by brilliant scholar Emily Grubert back in a 2022 paper. And she defines it as the transition period where zero carbon and emitting fossil fuel systems coexist at scales where each imposes operationally relevant constraints on the other. And I pulled these charts to show you that clearly both the United States and the United Kingdom are in the mid-transition, right? So each has peaked its fossil fuels and now is coming down in its trajectory, but is far from finished with the job of the energy transition to 100% clean energy. I will just note, these are different timescales and different scales on your vertical axes. One of these is doing much better than the other. You probably can guess which one, right? But the main point I want to make here is just we're in the middle of an arc towards the transition, but very much not there yet. In the UK, This is driven by a national legal mandate. So the goal that they've established in law, target, I should say, is net zero emissions by 2050. And then the Labor Party, which was elected on this pledge of accelerating progress on climate in 2024, has said that their goal is 95% clean energy by 2030. So a very aggressive target. US, if you haven't been under a rock, you probably know we don't have a national climate target right now. But New York does, right? So a lot of the progress in the states, a lot of the bending of this curve has come from state policies, including New York's, where their legal mandate is net zero by 2050 and 70% clean electricity by 2030. Okay, so I'll just say, right, like both places have done what I would call the easy work of the transition. A lot of the arc that you see so far has come from switching from coal to natural gas. A lot of the work that remains to be done is to figure out how you get gas off the system and move to a 100% clean energy system or capture the emissions of gas alternatively. So in both places, they're making progress. There's a lot of work left to be done. Let me talk a little bit about what progress has looked like so far and the policy tools that they've used to get there. So one of the reasons that I decided to do this comparative project between New York and the UK is that both of their systems look strikingly similar in their design. And that's because both pursued really robust, in the States, we tend to call it deregulation. In the UK, they tend to call it market liberalization, but same concept at work, like a big turn around the 80s to the 90s towards markets as a predominant theory of how to run an efficient, competitive energy system. So I've put up here a chart of the US. The system runs very similarly in the UK. Basically, you have independently owned generators who bid into a market. You have an entity that runs the market, and you have suppliers that compete for customers that buy out of that market and deliver to people that are actually going to end use electricity. And the predominant way that both New York and the United Kingdom has tried to transform the energy system is through sort of what I would call like tweaks and incentives and de-risking mechanisms that intervene in these markets. So just to give you a sense of this, in both places, one of the big strategies has been some sort of state subsidy that makes private developers want to invest in more clean energy. So in the UK, they've used this mechanism called a contract for difference. In the US, I think a prime example of this, while they existed, was Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, but we also had a longer history of tax credits even before the IRA, along with state design of markets to try to balance these systems, right? So through things like capacity markets, ancillary services markets, right? Like standing up additional markets on top of an electricity market to make sure you have a stable system. And then on the demand side, you've also seen the state try to intervene to drive the energy transition, mostly through purchasing requirements on energy suppliers. So in the United States, this has often taken the form of renewable portfolio standards, which was New York's basically precursor to its current standard. In the UK, this took the form of what they call a renewables obligation, but essentially the same policy tool. This is a slight oversimplification, right? Like the state has done some research and development and commercialization in both places, but I would argue this is a fair synopsis of the main tools that each place has used to try to take the system and drive it towards cleaner outcomes. The bad news I want to deliver is that both are now what I would call officially documented failures, by which I mean courts have actually said in each place that what the government is doing is violating their own laws because they're not making enough progress. So this happened twice in the UK, most recently in 2024. This is an ongoing battle in New York where a bunch of environmental groups sued and they got a judgment just a few months ago from a lower court saying that indeed New York has violated its law by not making faster progress towards its targets. So I want to spend a minute talking about what's going on. Like, why are these places having such a hard time meeting the targets that they have legally set for themselves? And I want to suggest that the mid-transition presents three big challenges that, again, these places are very much facing in common, I would say, because both of them redesigned their systems very similarly. right? So I think this is a set of challenges that you can expect to emerge in lots of markets that have embraced a pretty liberalized framework for delivering electricity. Okay, so let me say a word about each of these challenges. So the first one is difficulty just installing enough new clean energy capacity to meet targets. Some of you may be familiar with what are called interconnection queues in the US electricity system. Basically, if you're a renewable energy developer and you want to sign up to deliver power to the grid, you have to get in line and have the grid operator say to you, like, yes, it's your turn, we're going to let you interconnect. These lines have gotten so long that there is now twice as much energy in the queue waiting to connect to the grid as there is on the entire US grid, right? So we're having a really hard time getting new resources connected to the grid fast enough. Similar challenges adhere in the UK. They also have very long interconnection delays. The second problem is a challenge of energy affordability, right? And I would say, I think of energy affordability as, a pressing challenge in its own right, but also a political constraint on the transition, right? If you cannot deal with energy affordability, you're going to lose political support for the transition. And both places have really struggled with this. So here's a chart of electricity prices in the UK. Somewhat predictably, they shot up enormously around the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They came back down a little, but they've never really stabilized to levels that have been sort of politically acceptable. And we are really facing this affordability crunch in the States now. New York's Governor Hochul, has basically said she wants to back down the New York climate change goals because of affordability concerns. So this is an ongoing fight in the New York legislature right now. They can't meet their goals. So one of the answers seems to be, let's just rewrite the goals. Of course, all of this is dramatically exacerbated by the new war against Iran in ways that I think are very much playing out this minute. Okay, and then the last concern I wanted to talk about is this challenge of figuring out how you maintain reliability and consistency of service during the transition. The part of this puzzle that many of you are probably familiar with is that renewable resources just behave differently than coal and gas and nuclear, right? So the sun doesn't necessarily shine at the peak time of electricity demand. So part of what system operators face is just this challenge of like, how do we make the system come together with a really different set of resource characteristics to make sure that supply and demand match each other? The other piece of the transition in terms of reliability that I think is less discussed but equally important is, remember I said we were in the mid-transition, right? And the next hard part is to get off of gas. That is a really tricky transition problem that almost nowhere has solved yet, right? Because at the same time you're building up the electricity system, you have to be winding down the gas system, but in a way that doesn't leave people without a way to heat their house or heat their house affordably, right? So big challenges to sort of plan and manage this transition well. Okay, so one of the things that I argue in this draft paper is that one way to understand the set of challenges that's facing places like New York and the UK is as a challenge of state capacity. And I've put up here like a really sort of just classic generic definition of state capacity, right? The ability of the state to implement official goals. Getting to decarbonization is an official goal in both places. The state wants to do it, but it's really struggling with what's the right set of tools that's going to let us make the progress that we want to make towards this goal, right? Like why are we failing? It's because we don't have an appropriate set of policy tools that can take us from where we are to where we need to be. So what I'm really interested in is this question of, can state ownership be a response to this set of challenges, right? So as I mentioned earlier, that's the theory animating both of these reforms. So in the UK, we saw Great British Energy developed as a theory of like how you move this transition forward. In New York, same thing, right? Activists really campaigned on this idea that the challenge to New York's climate woes was at least in part public renewables. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about these new entities that each created. I'm going to touch on them from several angles, legal, theoretical, and political, but because I'm a lawyer by training, I thought we would start with the laws. So let's go to the laws establishing each. Great British Energy was established in legislation in, I want to say it was May 2025, so it's quite recent. And here's the mandate that they were given. They can facilitate, encourage, and participate in producing clean energy, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel energy, improving energy efficiency, and helping improve reliability. In the UK, they tend to call reliability security of supply, which for us, I think has a much more geopolitical meaning, but they essentially use it as reliability. The way that they're going to pay for this is through 8.3 billion of committed government money over this 5-year parliament, which is, not a huge amount of money, but not a trivial amount either. Okay, so New York. In New York, they are not starting from a blank slate like Britain, right? So Britain had to stand up this new entity, Great British Energy. The New York legislation basically just enlarged the authority of the New York Power Authority, or NYPA. So NYPA already owns some gas in the state, some transmission in the state, and is the big entity that controls a lot of the hydropower in New York. So what the New York legislation did is expand NYPA's power. And it gave it the power to plan, design, develop, finance, construct, own, operate, etc., renewable energy projects, with the caveat that they have to maintain majority ownership of anything that they invest in. The other thing I'll note about New York is NYPA was not given a big budget like Great British Energy was. Instead, the theory is that they will turn to their bonding authority as a public authority and use bonds to raise money. This lets them raise money typically much cheaper than a private utility. But it does mean that they have to be careful not to borrow too much money or else they impact their credit rating and it's not cheap anymore. They've also been given a little bit of state appropriations recently, but mostly they're resting on bonding authority. So the one thing I'll say about these legal mandates before I move on is just note that they're quite broad, right? They give these entities a lot of ability to just answer the question in the way they see fit of what should we build to speed the transition? How should we build it? What else should we do alongside that building? Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes. Oh, actually, no, before I spend a few minutes here, I thought it might be helpful to come back to my visual and just show you where these are intervening in this schematic. And I would say the place to put them is here, right? In this theory, instead of sort of trying to push private generation or push private suppliers, the state is intervening as one among many generators itself in the system. Okay, so now I want to turn and talk a little bit about what's the theory animating this? How should we understand these as climate policy solutions? And the first thing I want to do is just make a point that you really can't draw a clean line from past precedents or theories here. So let me say a little bit about why. In the United States, we've long had some public power. Public power still supplies about 14% of Americans, and it typically takes the form of a municipally owned electricity system, right? So a city that owns its power. LA owns its power, Seattle owns its power, Boulder owns its power, etc. So a bunch of cities in the United States have said, well, maybe we should take over our electricity grid as a theory of like how to sort of spur climate progress. And they've tried this lots of places. One activist friend that I was talking to about this said, and I don't have this in an academic citation, so take it with a grain of salt, but said that by his count, there have been 68 attempts at taking over electricity systems in the past 10 or 15 years, and 68 failures, right? So this is not this is a strategy that has a lot of political momentum, but not a lot of practical bite, in large part because private utilities hate this idea, right? They resist takeovers tooth and nail because you're basically taking out a piece of their service territory on which they earn their profits. Okay, so the first point I want to make is just this looks really different than a takeover, what these places are doing, right? Instead of saying we want to substitute for a private utility, what they're saying is we want to complement, right? We want to work side by side to try to make this transition happen faster. And there's a quote that the UK government gave along these lines that I think is very indicative of their thinking. So here's what they said. The UK government has explained that it's pursuing a 21st century modern public ownership model that helps deliver a dynamic state working in partnership with industry, workers, and unions, right? So there's a robust theorization of these public power movements in the US, but I don't think it fits this model here. I think they're doing something different. Okay, the second past precedent that is often trotted out in this space, and this particularly I found to be true in my UK research, is that of big state-owned energy companies that are building renewables across the world, right? And in particular, the Scandinavians get invoked here, right? So you hear a lot about Ørsted from Denmark and Vattenfall and Statkraft from Sweden and Norway. And this is the kind of rhetoric that you see around this, right? So in the UK, they argued 42.2% of the installed capacity from operational and under construction wind farms is owned by foreign public entities, including state-owned enterprises and public pension funds, right? So you heard a lot of the campaigners there saying things like, why would we let Denmark own all of our wind? Why wouldn't we have the UK own our wind instead, right? So like big state-owned energy company as sort of like a profit engine for the state. In some ways, I think that this is an interesting analogy for what the UK and New York are trying to do, right? Because they are proof of concept that you can have private and public competing in the same markets and have it work. But they're also so historically different, and they're trying to do such different things that I don't think they're great analogs, right? These companies tend to mostly act like any other for-profit big wind developer, and they tend to mostly act in foreign markets, right? So they're not designed as like a climate accelerator kind of policy tool. They're just designed as a way for the state to make money by operating like any other private company. And the other thing I'll say is basically all of the examples that are trotted out here grew out of state oil and gas companies that were looking to pivot as their priorities changed at a governmental level. So you had a ton of pre-existing knowledge and resources. And this mostly happened during a period where like there was a lot of ability to compete in a very nascent marketplace. That is not the case anymore, right? So when you're trying to stand up a new ability in today's really tight marketplace with a lot of political volatility, you're not going to see the same sort of like enormous ability to act at a global scale that you have with companies like Ørsted. Okay. So I think past precedents are interesting and somewhat instructive, but like actually don't really get us a good theory of what's going on here with these new entities in the New York and the UK. So then what is a good theory? I'm going to come back here to these three challenges that I said were happening both in New York and the UK as they struggle to meet their climate goals. And so I'm really interested in this question of like, can public power help us meet some of the central challenges that these systems are butting up against? So let's think through a little bit together how it might play this role. Right, so first, there's difficulty in installing enough clean energy. The theory of public power here is that the state comes in and they invest in otherwise non-financeable projects, right? So they bring in some projects that private developers can't seem to get financed, and they add that to the overall pool of projects getting pursued. In doing that, they earn some money. They sell their electricity into the market just like anybody else. They earn some money. They can take that money and reinvest, right? And create this cycle where you're speeding up development. When it comes to energy affordability, I think there's two different theories at work here of how public renewables might help. You see both articulated. Which path they're going to predominantly pursue remains an open question. Okay, so theory number one is when you accelerate renewable energy, you automatically make electricity cheaper, right? Because natural gas tends to be the highest priced resource in electricity markets, and it sets the price for everyone when it's being used. But if you bring in enough renewables so the natural gas is setting the price less often, then you bring down the cost of electricity. So this is one theory of how they might help with affordability. The second theory is like a much more robust theory of how public renewables might tie to affordability, which is that the state could decide that instead of selling into these markets, it's going to bypass the market and create some sort of special contract that gives somebody electricity more cheaply, right? And in this case, you're not lowering overall systemic affordability, but you are creating affordability for particular parties that you basically deem worthy of getting cheaper electricity than everybody else. Okay, and then this third challenge of maintaining reliability and consistency. What public power can potentially do here is help think about the system as a whole and where there are gaps in the system that private entities aren't filling, right? So they can do things like try to stimulate supply chains through their particular investments, or look at a portfolio of projects and think about what else do we need to feel like our system is stable. Okay, so this is essentially, I think, a pretty good articulation of the potential that public power has to try to come in and chip away at some of these big challenges that are holding back the transition. I thought I'd spend a minute just talking about what they've actually done so far, as a way of illustrating how I think that their actions might fit into this theory. So I'll start with Great British Energy. They've done a few big things so far. The first is the very first project that they announced is $180 million to put solar panels on schools and hospitals. And they said whatever savings come from doing this, it will get reinvested back into the school system and the hospital system, right? So here's a targeted energy affordability initiative, essentially. They're speeding deployment a little bit by doing some distributed solar, but it's also a real political move, right? To say, look, this is the kind of company that's going to make your education system and your hospital system better at the same time that it's investing in clean energy. They've also put $300 million into offshore wind supply chains, right? On this theory that if you sort of invest in the front of the system, you'll give some confidence to the market that will help it develop more rapidly in the UK and make it sort of an engine of offshore wind progress. The third thing I put up here is a little bit more controversial. So in June of this past year, the government announced that of the 8.3 billion that were going to Great British Energy, they wanted 2.3 billion of that to specifically go to advanced nuclear power. Some people said this is just a great sort of clarification of the mission. Other people said you effectively cut the money from clean energy and put it towards nuclear. It was a controversial move. NYPA is a little bit earlier in its journey towards actually putting money towards anything, but they did release their updated strategic plan for where they plan to invest first just a couple months ago. And basically what they said is we're going to build a lot of utility scale solar and storage, about 5.5 gigawatts of capacity in total. So just for context, the New York system now is about 37 gigawatts. And what they've calculated is that if they're going to make up the progress that they need to get to their 2030 target, they need to build about 15 gigawatts more. So this is not making up the entirety of the gap, but it's closing about a third of the gap if NYPA is able to do everything that it said it's going to do. And I'll just note that 90% of the projects they're embarking on, they're doing with a private partner, right? And they've said they basically tried to go out and find partners who were having trouble getting private financing and use NYPA financing to take projects over the finish line that otherwise weren't going to get there. They also have a program targeting affordability. Basically, their theory of how to do targeted affordability is to direct the money from certain projects towards low-income households. Again, still in the works, not up and running yet. And very similarly to Great British Energy, the government charged NYPA with also building advanced nuclear this past summer. So nuclear is a mandated part of NYPA's portfolio going forward, just like GBEs. Okay. So this is the last thing I want to do. The last thing I want to do is just think a little bit through some of the tensions and choices that these new experiments in public power present. And I'll start with three tensions that I see coming out as these entities try to move from theory to implementation. The first is, although these entities have plenty of money to start to invest in new projects, they don't get to skip the queues, right? There's no law that said, because you're public, you don't have to wait in line with everybody else. And so they're not getting around a lot of the bottlenecks that private developers are facing. Now, NYPA has said, I think with a little bit of hubris that it thinks it can do it better than private developers. I pulled a quote on this. They said, while NYPA is subject to the same siting and permitting processes as any other developer, our expertise in the regulatory landscape in New York State and at federal agencies is a competitive advantage in moving projects forward efficiently. Maybe, right? Like maybe it will be. I think, though, it's going to be marginally useful there, right? So it doesn't fix the bottleneck problem, and I think they're going to have to fix it separately. Okay, the second tension, there's a set of articulated goals that cannot all be pursued in tandem, right? So if what you want to do is have these entities invest in cutting edge technologies that private companies aren't willing to invest in, a la advanced nuclear, right, which each have been ordered to do, you're not probably going to make a lot of money for the state, right? Like these are expensive, risky, first of a kind technologies. It's a perfectly legitimate aim to decide that what the state should do is invest in those kinds of technologies. But you cannot do that and then also have a lot of money come back to either address affordability or, keep investing and trying to make projects go faster, right? So you can do a whole lot of utility scale solar and have the projects get developed pretty quickly and bring money back in that you can then reinvest or use to solve affordability. But you're going to have to make choices between, do we want to do risky, innovative stuff to drive the transition, or do we want to do like mass deployment to drive the transition? And how much of the money we make do we want to put back into going faster versus giving people some bill pressure relief, right? Okay. And then the third tension that I thought I'd mention is one of the big aims of activists in pushing for these entities, this particularly came up in New York, was this idea that we could make the transition more democratic by turning to public power, right? Like you could build in processes for more deliberation. You could put different people on the boards that would make a different set of decisions. Like there was one of the bills that was floated in New York included board seats for labor and for environmental justice groups. That did not make it through. And basically what NYPA has said is like, what we're good at is efficiency, not democracy, right? They're not building in any extra processes here. And so, if what you want to do is use these entities to really speed up how fast the transition is going, there's a real tension with thinking that that's going to happen alongside a democratization of decision-making at the organizations. And so far, I would say accelerated deployment has very much trumped any effort to think through like a more democratic, different way of energy decision-making. I did a series of interviews with a bunch of people that were involved in standing these up as part of my research. And I thought that this answer to one of my questions was really telling. So I asked the interviewee, and I promised them confidentiality, what would success look like for Great British Energy? And I asked this specifically about 2029, because that's the end of their first parliamentary 5-year period where they're supposed to have spent down this money. And they said, success would be if they've catalyzed the start of 10 really cutting edge projects that start to scale out, deployed conventional renewables on the public sector estate, and returned value back to taxpayers, right? And like, we went on to have a fascinating conversation where he ultimately was like, yeah, I realize we can't do all three of those things, right? Like there's no chance that with $8.3 billion, we're going to do 10 cutting edge projects, also massively invest in like sort of classic renewables and give a whole lot of money back to the government, right? Like you're going to have to make some hard choices here. And I think the implementation pathway is going to be one of making these choices. Okay, so these tensions that came up a lot as I talked to people about these projects led to what I will say was a strikingly commonly used insult against them. I heard this from so many people. I don't know exactly where it originated, but it's clearly very catchy, and everyone thought it fit the bill. So what all of these people said is, these public renewables companies, they're a solution in search of a problem, right? By which they meant like, it's not actually obvious exactly what problem in the system they're responding to. They just seem to be popular and like sort of like scratch a populist itch to do something because everybody's angry at the energy system. But like, I don't see how they're actually a solution to any particular problem. And what I want to suggest as a result of my thinking through this is that I actually think this might be exactly what is right with them. So if you go back to my argument that what we're facing here is somewhat of a state capacity challenge, right? Like the state is really struggling with, how do I design the right set of tools to try to intervene in this very liberalized system and get it to do what I want it to do? And I actually think that compared to this ability to just sort of like tweak at the edges of markets, this new set of public companies gives the government actually like a lot of flexibility and nimbleness, which I know is not a word we usually associate with the government, but like the design of these is actually meant to make them quite nimble problem solvers in figuring out where are problems arising in the system and how might I intervene effectively to respond, right? So they won't be able to address all the problems at once, and they will have to make hard choices. But I think that the public nature and the broad mandate of them actually gives them a lot of flexibility to make those hard choices in ways that classic administrative agencies really cannot in our system. So the argument I develop in the paper is just that I think that this kind of enhanced flexible state capacity is a really important tool in the toolkit. They're not a catch-all answer. They're not going to suddenly solve every problem with the energy transition. They're going to have to be pursued in tandem with other reforms like permitting and interconnection reforms. And I think my other big note of caution is I really want them not to overpromise on affordability. I do not think at the scales that they're being pursued, they're a big answer to affordability challenges. I think that they can be sort of like a nice sort of political talking point if deployed in the right kinds of ways, but like to actually make a dent in affordability, we're going to have to dramatically rethink how we structure our markets. And that's going to have to happen for the transition to continue, whether or not you do public renewables. But I am really heartened by these entities as potential, like really useful state tools in trying to address mid-transition challenges where, the set of challenges that we're going to face in the second half of the transition is likely to look quite different and quite new. And I think having this kind of enhanced state capacity is going to be really important as states confront the challenges that keep percolating through trying to solve a new big set of energy transition challenges. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'm excited for your questions.